Barron Trump bought food for a homeless veteran. The next day, something incredible happened. Barron Trump walked his familiar route through the waking city, phone pressed to his ear as he chatted with his mother. His voice carried a mix of excitement and thoughtfulness as he shared plans for the coming weeks, weaving between updates about his studies and the small goals he hoped to achieve. The sun began its slow ascent, its pale rays pushing through a layer of mist, casting a soft golden hue over the streets. The city stirred gently. A car horn here, the clatter of a delivery truck there, while the mingling smells of fresh bread, damp asphalt, and faint exhaust filled the crisp morning air. As Barron continued his conversation, his steps slowed. Something unusual caught his eye. A man slumped over in a battered wheelchair. Scattered around him were crumpled newspapers and discarded wrappers, a stark contrast to the brightly lit storefronts and bustling life just a few steps away. "Hold on, Mom," Barron said, his tone shifting. He lowered the phone slightly, his attention fixed on the figure. The man was gaunt, his clothes worn thin, and his shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. In his lap, a tarnished military badge glinted faintly in the sunlight, its surface scratched but still recognizable. Barron stopped, his heart tightening at the sight. The man's stillness seemed to anchor him, urging him to pause despite the familiar rhythm of his walk. He ended the call gently, murmuring, "I'll call you back in a bit," before slipping his phone into his pocket and taking a deliberate step forward. "Morning, sir," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The man's head tilted up with deliberate slowness, his pale blue eyes narrowing as they met Barron's. There was suspicion there, and surprise, as though human kindness were an unfamiliar concept. "You need something?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, worn by years of cold nights and harder days. There was no hostility in his tone, only weariness. Barron shook his head. "No, sir. I just thought you might want something to eat." The man's gaze flicked to Barron's face, searching for something, motive perhaps, or sincerity. His fingers tightened around the badge. "Don't need no charity," he muttered, though his voice wavered, betraying his hunger. "It's not charity," Barron replied evenly, a faint smile softening his features. "Call it breakfast. Everyone deserves that." The man studied him for another long moment, then exhaled, sharply, the sound more sigh than breath. "Name's Richard," he said finally, his voice barely more than a rasp. He shifted slightly in his chair, as though the act of speaking had cost him something. "Don't know why you're bothering?" Barron shrugged, his smile lingering. "Maybe I just don't like seeing someone go hungry," he said simply. Before Richard could protest, Barron stood. "Wait here. I'll be back in a minute." He turned and walked briskly toward the nearest cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread greeted Barron as he pushed open the cafe door, a small bell jingling faintly above his head. The transition from the damp chill of the street to the welcoming warmth inside was almost disorienting. Soft amber lighting bathed the interior, casting a golden glow over polished wooden tables and glass cases brimming with pastries. A low hum of conversation mingled with the hiss of steaming milk, creating an ambiance that felt worlds away from the cold curb where Richard waited. Barron approached the counter, his hands resting on its smooth surface as his eyes scanned the menu. Behind the counter, a barista moved with practiced efficiency, her movements precise, yet relaxed. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but distracted. "A sandwich," Barron replied, his voice measured. He glanced toward the pastries, then back at the sandwiches, neatly wrapped in parchment. "And a coffee. Black." As she rang up the order, Barron's thoughts wandered. He pictured Richard's trembling hands, the way his fingers had clutched that tarnished badge, like it was the only thing anchoring him. The barista handed him the bag and coffee, breaking his reverie. He nodded in thanks and turned to leave, the warmth of the cafe fading as he stepped back into the cold. Richard hadn't moved from his spot. His shoulders were still hunched, his focus fixed on the ground, as if the world around him didn't exist. Barron crouched down beside him, the aroma of the coffee rising between them. "Here," he said, holding out the bag and cup. Richard's gaze flickered upward, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly. He hesitated, his hands twitching before finally reaching for the offering. His fingers closed around the bag with a grip that seemed both desperate and cautious. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough and barely audible. Barron watched as Richard unwrapped the sandwich, his movements slow and deliberate. The steam from the bread curled into the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee. Richard took a small bite, chewing methodically, his eyes never quite meeting Barron's. "Been a while since anyone stopped," Richard said after a moment, his voice thick with something unspoken. He paused, setting the sandwich down carefully on his lap. "People pass by, you know, look right through you." Barron didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle, the weight of them filling the space between them. "That must be hard," he said finally, his tone quiet but sincere. Richard's lips twitched, a faint attempt at a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's worse at first," he admitted. "You think someone will notice, maybe help. Then you realize they don't. And you stop expecting it." Barron nodded, his gaze steady. "But you keep going," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "That takes strength." Richard let out a dry laugh, the sound hollow but not unkind. "Strength," he repeated, shaking his head. "That's one way to put it." There was a pause, the kind that felt less like silence and more like the quiet unraveling of stories untold. Barron glanced at the badge still resting in Richard's lap. "That badge, it means something, doesn't it?" Richard's hand instinctively moved to cover it, his fingers brushing against the worn metal. "It used to," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Back when I had a job, a home, before." He trailed off, his gaze drifting somewhere distant. Barron didn't press, sensing the raw edges of a story too heavy to tell. Instead, he shifted slightly, letting the cool pavement beneath him anchor the moment. "I'm glad it still matters to you," he said simply. Richard's expression softened, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his guarded exterior. "It's all I got left," he admitted quietly. "That and memories." The click of a camera shutter interrupted the moment, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Across the street, a man adjusted his lens, his gaze lingering on the scene before him. The interaction between Barron and Richard had caught his eye, an unspoken story etched in their contrasting figures, their shared moment of connection. Barron and Richard didn't notice him. The city buzzed on around them, indifferent and distant. Richard picked up the sandwich again, taking another slow bite. The lines on his face seemed less pronounced now, his posture slightly less hunched. Barron leaned back on his hands, the edges of his mouth curling into a faint smile. As the coffee cup emptied and the sandwich wrapper crinkled in Richard's lap, Barron glanced at his watch. The day was moving on, and so would the city, but he lingered for a moment longer. "I should get going," he said eventually, his tone reluctant. Richard nodded, his fingers curling around the empty coffee cup. "Thanks," he said again, his voice firmer this time. "Not just for this, for noticing." Barron stood, his hands sliding into his pockets as he looked down at Richard. "Take care, Richard," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity. He turned and walked away, his figure gradually blending into the bustling crowd. Richard watched him go, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, the air around him felt a little less cold, the street a little less indifferent. Across the street, the photographer lowered her camera, her fingers hovering over the screen as she reviewed the image. The scene he'd captured was simple, unassuming, yet it carried a quiet power, a testament to kindness, fleeting but profound. And so, the city moved on, its rhythm unchanged. But for Richard, and perhaps even for Barron, the moment lingered, a small act of kindness that bridged two worlds, leaving both a little warmer than before. The street photographer felt that Barron's act of kindness needed to be shared with the world. Without hesitation, he connected the camera's memory card to his computer and uploaded the images to his social media page. The photo emerged online the next morning, quiet and unassuming, like the first ripple in a still pond. The caption was brief: an act of kindness. Sometimes it's the smallest things that make the biggest impact. It featured Barron crouched beside Richard, the sandwich and coffee visible between them. The lighting, softened by the early sun, caught the genuine connection in Barron's face and the fragile gratitude in Richard's. It started small. A few likes, a handful of shares. Comments trickled in. Faith in humanity restored. This is what the world needs more of. Who's the kid? Looks familiar. The ripples grew. By afternoon, the post had exploded, shared thousands of times across platforms. The photograph, captured without Barron's knowledge, began to draw attention for reasons beyond its emotional core. Keen-eyed users dissected the image, matching Barron's profile to photographs from public archives. By evening, the question was answered with certainty. The young man in the hoodie was none other than Barron Trump, son of the President of the United States. The revelation sent shockwaves across social media. Comment sections swelled with admiration and speculation. Wait, this is the president's son, out here helping a homeless vet. He didn't even want recognition. That's real humility. Why is he dressed like that? Trying to avoid the Secret Service? News outlets quickly picked up the story, splashing the photograph across headlines. The narrative shifted from a simple act of kindness to a question of character. Was this emblematic of the Trump family's values, or was Barron acting on his own? Barron, meanwhile, remains oblivious to the growing storm. His phone buzzed relentlessly, but he ignored it, spending the day lost in his usual routine. It wasn't until late evening, when a family friend texted him a news link, that he realized what had happened. His chest tightened as he read through the article. The quiet, unspoken kindness he'd intended to leave behind had now become a symbol, larger than he ever imagined. He stared at the photo, his face framed in soft light, and felt an odd mixture of pride and unease. Across the city, Richard began to notice changes too. A woman approached him that afternoon, leaving a warm jacket by his wheelchair with a whisper, "Take care." A man stopped to hand him a $5 bill, his expression unusually earnest. These small gestures piled up like bricks, forming something unfamiliar yet comforting: hope. Meanwhile, the story reached the Oval Office. President Trump leans back in his chair, his usual stoicism giving way to a flicker of pride as he studied the photograph. For a moment, he was not the leader of a nation, but a father, seeing a quiet strength in his son that touched him deeply. That evening, during a press briefing, he spoke directly about the photo. "My son's act reminds us all of something we often overlook: simple kindness. It's inspired me to do more. Today, I'm announcing a new initiative to support homeless veterans across this country. Together, we can give back to those who've given so much for us. The announcement, like the photograph, rippled outward, galvanizing a wave of support. Barron watched the news coverage quietly from his room, his emotions tangled. The world now sees him as something more than a name or a legacy. But beneath the surface, he wondered, could he ever separate who he was from what the world expected of him? Back on the street corner, Richard sat wrapped in his new jacket. The weight of the day's kindness warms him more than the fabric ever could. A copy of the photograph, crinkled but cherished, rested in his lap. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a thought he'd long buried. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. And somewhere in the city, the photographer smiled at her phone, watching the world awaken to a moment she had captured, a moment of connection, of humanity, and of quiet revolution. The Oval Office brimmed with quiet resolve as President Trump approached the podium. His voice, firm yet reflective, carried across the room. This country owes a debt to those who have served, a debt that cannot go unpaid. Today, we take a step toward repaying that debt. His words were deliberate, measured. Behind him, a slideshow flickered. Conceptual renderings of housing complexes designed for homeless veterans. Each image was a testament to a growing movement, sparked by a single photograph of his son. Across the city, in the common room of a local shelter, Richard sat hunched in a worn armchair. A television, donated by a kind stranger, played the speech live. His weathered hands gripped the crinkled photo of Barron, his eyes glistening as the president detailed the initiative. Words like dignity, respect, and second chances reached him in waves, and for the first time in years, they didn't feel hollow. Construction began within weeks. Barron followed the updates quietly, his presence a subtle but steady influence. The designs were practical yet welcoming. Bright facades, accessible layouts, and spaces for community connection. Donations poured in from individuals and corporations alike, each contributor touched by the story of a veteran and the young man who noticed him. Workers toiled through rain and sun, their determination matched by the urgency of the cause. Barron visited the site often, blending into the background in his usual understated manner. He spoke little, his actions speaking louder than any words could. On one visit, he spotted Richard among the crowd, now volunteering to assist the workers. Their eyes met across the lot, and Barron approached, his hands in his pockets. Richard straightened, brushing dust from his jacket. "Didn't expect to see you here," Richard said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of emotion. "I could say the same to you," Barron replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Richard chuckled softly, glancing at the bustling construction. "Figured it was time I gave something back. You started this, kid. Least I can do is finish it." Barron's response was quiet, but heartfelt. "You didn't need to, but I'm glad you're here." Months later, the first housing complex stood complete, its walls painted a warm cream that glowed under the afternoon sun. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the air buzzed with anticipation. Veterans, families, volunteers, and donors filled the courtyard, their faces a mix of pride and gratitude. Barron stood beside his father, the latter delivering an impassioned speech about hope and unity, but Barron's gaze wandered to Richard, seated in the front row. Their eyes met, and Richard nodded, a gesture of respect, gratitude, and something unspoken. The ribbon was cut, applause erupted, and the crowd surged forward to explore the building. Barron stayed back, his hands tucked into his pockets as he watched Richard wheel himself toward the entrance. The setting sun bathed the complex in golden light, the American flag on the roof catching the breeze. Richard paused at the threshold, looking up at the structure that symbolized not just shelter, but a second chance. The camera panned wide, capturing the moment as Richard entered his new home. Above him, the flag flapped softly, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as Barron turned to leave, his expression reflected everything he felt: pride, humility, and a glimmer of hope for a world still capable of kindness.